A man stands in the center of a crowded square. Thousands watch in silence. The air is thick with something you can almost taste. Fear, anticipation, dread. And what's about to happen to this man will be so horrifying, so unthinkably brutal, that the most powerful empire on earth will try to erase it from history completely. But here's the thing. They failed. Because you can burn documents. You can silence witnesses. You can threaten anyone who dares speak the truth. But you cannot kill a memory that lives in the bones of a civilization. You cannot erase the nightmares that passed from parent to child for generations. And today, right now, you're going to learn exactly what they were trying to hide. This is the story of a punishment so terrifying that nobles barricaded themselves in their estates. Riots consumed the capital for weeks, and an entire civilization fundamentally changed how it dealt with crime, rebellion, and dissent overnight. One execution, one man, and an empire that would never be the same. But before I tell you what happened to him in that square, before I describe the device they built specifically for his destruction, you need to understand something crucial. You need to understand who this man was and why the most powerful people on earth wanted him not just dead, but erased from existence itself. Because this wasn't about justice. This was about sending a message. And the message they sent echoed far louder than they ever intended. His name was Marcus. 6 months before that crowd gathered in the square, Marcus was one of the most respected men in the empire. A high-ranking official in the imperial administration. A trusted advisor who had the emperor's ear. The kind of man who shaped policy, commanded respect, and moved through the halls of power like he belonged there. Because he did belong there. Marcus had spent 20 years climbing the ranks. He started as a minor bureaucrat, handling mundane administrative tasks that nobody else wanted. But he had something that set him apart. A mind that could see patterns others missed. An ability to solve problems that had plagued the empire for generations. Within a decade, he had risen to oversee the empire's treasury. Within 15 years, he was advising the emperor directly on matters of state security. By the time he turned 45, Marcus was arguably the third most powerful man in the empire. He had wealth. He had influence. He had the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. So what changed? How does a man go from the emperor's inner circle to the center of an execution square in less than 6 months? One word. Treason. Now, stay with me here because this is where the story takes its first dark turn. The accusation came out of nowhere. One morning, Marcus woke up in his estate, surrounded by servants and luxury, planning his schedule for the day. By evening, he was in chains. The charges were severe. Conspiracy against the emperor. Plotting to overthrow the government. Communication with foreign enemies. Each accusation carried the death penalty on its own. Together, they painted a picture of a man who had betrayed everything he claimed to serve. But here's what the official records don't tell you. The evidence was flimsy at best. Witnesses contradicted themselves under basic questioning. Documents that supposedly proved Marcus's guilt conveniently appeared out of nowhere, written in handwriting that didn't quite match his own. The trial lasted barely a day, a mockery of the legal system Marcus himself had helped build. None of it mattered. The verdict was decided before the trial began. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. The judges knew it. The prosecutors knew it. Marcus himself knew it. because Marcus hadn't committed treason in any traditional sense. He hadn't plotted a coup or communicated with enemies or stolen military secrets. No, Marcus had done something far more dangerous. He had asked questions. See, in his position overseeing the treasury, Marcus had access to financial records that few others could see. And in those records, he discovered something disturbing. Money was disappearing. Not small amounts that could be explained by accounting errors. Massive sums that could only mean one thing: corruption at the highest levels. Someone was stealing from the empire. And based on the patterns Marcus identified, that someone had to be extraordinarily powerful. Powerful enough to hide their tracks from everyone else. Powerful enough to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. Marcus made a mistake that would cost him everything. He told the wrong person what he'd found. Within a week, the accusations of treason emerged. Within a month, he was on trial for his life. And within 6 months, he was standing in that square, facing a fate that would haunt the empire for centuries. But the people who orchestrated his downfall weren't satisfied with a simple execution. A beheading would have been too quick, too clean, too forgettable. They wanted Marcus to suffer. They wanted everyone to see that suffering. And they wanted the memory of that suffering to burn itself into the consciousness of every citizen who might ever think about asking inconvenient questions. So they created something special for him. Something that would later become known by a name that still sends chills down the spines of historians who study this period. The scorpion's sting. Now, I need you to understand something about this empire before we go further. This was not a civilization that shied away from brutal punishment. Public executions were common. Methods that would horrify modern sensibilities were considered routine. The people of this empire had seen death in countless forms. But they had never seen anything like what they built for Marcus. The scorpion's sting was a device designed with a single purpose in mind: to inflict the maximum possible pain for the longest possible duration while keeping the victim conscious and aware throughout the entire ordeal. It wasn't about killing Marcus. Death was almost incidental. The point was the suffering, the spectacle, the message, and the engineers who designed it were terrifyingly good at their jobs. The morning of the execution, something unusual happened in the capital. Something that should have warned everyone about what was coming. The streets fell silent. This was a city of over 1 million people. Merchants who set up their stalls before dawn. Traders who haggled loudly over prices. Children who played in the streets while their parents worked. Beggars who called out for coins. Soldiers who marched through on patrol. Every single day, the capital hummed with noise and activity. It was one of the great cities of the ancient world, and it sounded like it. But that morning, nothing. Shops stayed closed. Stalls remained empty. People who had to travel kept their heads down and moved quickly, as if trying to avoid being noticed. Even the children seemed to sense that something was wrong. They stayed inside, watching through windows, their usual games forgotten. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath. The nobles were the most telling sign. These were men who had witnessed countless executions. Men who had ordered deaths without flinching. Men who considered themselves above the fears and concerns of common citizens. That morning they stayed home, not out of solidarity with Marcus. Many of them had participated in his downfall, either actively or through their silence. No, they stayed home because whispers had spread through their networks about what was planned. About the device that had been constructed in secret. About the spectacle that was meant to send a message not just to commoners, but to them. The message was simple. If we can do this to one of you, we can do it to any of you. Ask yourself something. What kind of punishment is so terrifying that it frightens the very people who created it? What kind of execution makes the executioners hesitate? You're about to find out. Marcus was taken from his cell before sunrise. They didn't give him a final meal. They didn't allow him to see his family one last time. They didn't even let him wash or change his clothes. The Empire wanted him to face his death exactly as he was. Broken, dirty, humiliated. But Marcus refused to break. Witnesses who survived the purge that came later described a man who walked with his head held high despite the chains weighing him down. A man who looked his captors in the eye instead of staring at the ground. A man who, even knowing what awaited him, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing his fear. This made what came next even more significant, because by the end, even Marcus was screaming. They dragged him through the streets slowly, not because they needed to, but because they wanted every citizen to see. Windows that had been shuttered cracked open as people watched the procession pass. Some cried, some cursed. Most simply stared in horrified silence. The route took almost 2 hours. Through the merchant district, past the temples, along the waterfront where ships from across the known world once unloaded their cargo. Finally, into the central square where a wooden platform had been erected overnight. And on that platform sat the device. Contemporary descriptions are incomplete. The Empire's later attempts to destroy all records were partially successful. But historians have pieced together enough from surviving fragments, hidden journals, and oral traditions to understand what Marcus faced. The scorpion's sting was a mechanical nightmare. At its center was a large wooden frame, almost like a bed tilted at an angle so the crowd could see everything clearly. The victim would be strapped to this frame, completely immobilized, unable to move even an inch. Surrounding the frame were a series of articulated metal arms. Each arm ended in a different implement. Some were blades of varying sizes. Others were hooks. Still others were heated elements that could be adjusted to precise temperatures. But the true horror was in the design philosophy. Unlike other execution methods that aimed for quick death, the scorpion's sting was calibrated to avoid hitting vital organs or major blood vessels. Every cut, every burn, every insertion of those terrible hooks was calculated to cause maximum pain, while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as physically possible. Some accounts suggest the device was partially automated. Once set in motion, it would proceed through a predetermined sequence of torments, moving from one area of the body to another in a pattern designed to prevent shock from providing any merciful unconsciousness. The executioners weren't there to operate the machine. They were there to make sure it didn't kill Marcus too quickly. When Marcus was brought onto the platform, the crowd numbered in the tens of thousands. They had come expecting an execution. A brutal one, certainly, given the severity of the charges. But an execution nonetheless. Something that would be over in minutes, perhaps an hour at most. They had no idea what they were about to witness. The first phase began with restraint. Marcus was stripped of his remaining clothing and strapped to the frame. Metal bands locked around his wrists, ankles, neck, and waist. Smaller restraints immobilized his fingers and toes individually. By the time they finished, he couldn't move anything except his eyes. And his mouth. They left his mouth free. They wanted the crowd to hear him. What happened next lasted, according to the most reliable accounts, over 6 hours. I won't describe every detail. Some things are too terrible to put into words, and the historical record is mercifully incomplete. But I will tell you what the accounts agree on. The device worked exactly as designed. It began with the extremities, fingers and toes, then moved slowly, methodically inward. Each phase was calibrated to a specific duration. Each wound was treated just enough to prevent fatal blood loss. The heated elements cauterized as they cut, sealing blood vessels while maximizing nerve damage. Marcus screamed. This man who had walked to his execution with his head held high. This man who had refused to show fear in front of his captors. This man who had looked his accusers in the eye without flinching. He screamed until his voice gave out, and then he kept trying to scream. The crowd watched in horror. Many vomited. Some fainted and had to be carried away by friends or family. Others simply turned and fled, unable to force themselves to witness another moment. But most stayed, not because they wanted to, not because they enjoyed what they were seeing. They stayed because they understood on some primal level that they were witnessing something that would change everything. Something they would need to remember. Something they would need to tell their children, not as entertainment but as warning. The Empire had crossed a line, and everyone who watched knew it. The strangest part came near the end. After hours of torment, when Marcus's body was barely recognizable as human, when he had long since stopped being able to produce sounds, something happened that no one expected. He smiled. Witnesses disagree on exactly when this occurred. Some say it was in the 5th hour. Others claim it was later. But multiple independent accounts confirm that at some point during his ordeal, Marcus's ruined face twisted into something that resembled a smile. Was it madness, finally claiming him after hours of unimaginable agony? Was it defiance, a final gesture of contempt toward those who had destroyed him? Or was it something else entirely? Did Marcus, in his final moments of consciousness, see something that gave him peace? Did he understand that his death would achieve what his life could not? We'll never know. What we do know is that smile haunted the executioners. Several of them were reported to have fled their posts immediately after the execution concluded. At least one took his own life within the week, leaving behind a note that mentioned Marcus by name. When it was finally over, when Marcus's body was finally still, the silence in the square was absolute. Tens of thousands of people and not a single sound. No crying. No talking. Not even breathing, it seemed. Just silence. And then someone threw a rock. The aftermath of Marcus's execution was supposed to demonstrate the Empire's absolute power. It was supposed to frighten potential dissidents into submission. It was supposed to show everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, that challenging the established order meant facing a fate worse than death. Instead, it lit a fire. By nightfall, the capital was burning. It started in the merchant district. Someone knocked over a lamp during a confrontation with imperial guards. The flames spread to a nearby warehouse. Within an hour, the entire district was ablaze. But the fire wasn't an accident. It was a catalyst, As the flames rose, people who had watched Marcus die in silence finally found their voices. They poured into the streets by the thousands, then tens of thousands. They attacked government buildings. They dragged imperial officials from their homes. They overturned the symbols of authority that had governed their lives for generations. The riots spread to 6 districts simultaneously. The Imperial Guard, caught completely off guard, struggled to maintain any semblance of order. For the first time in living memory, the Empire's grip on its own capital was slipping. And it wasn't just the common people. The nobles, those wealthy and powerful men who had stayed home to avoid witnessing the execution, suddenly found themselves targets. Mobs surrounded their estates. Some were broken into and looted. A few nobles were caught in the streets and beaten, their fine clothing and jewelry marking them as enemies. The elite who had participated in Marcus's downfall, either through action or silence, suddenly realized they had made a terrible miscalculation. They thought executing Marcus would strengthen their position. Instead, they had united the entire population against them. Within 48 hours, the imperial leadership understood they had lost control of the narrative. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate their power had instead revealed their weakness, their cruelty, their willingness to destroy anyone, even one of their own, to maintain their grip on authority. And so they began the cover-up. The order came from the highest levels. Every record of Marcus's execution was to be destroyed. Court documents, witness testimonies, engineering specifications for the scorpion's sting. Even the attendance records showing which officials had been present. All of it, gone. Imperial agents spread across the capital and beyond, collecting and destroying any evidence that Marcus had ever existed. Historians who had recorded the event found their notes confiscated. Artists who had sketched the scene had their work burned in front of them. The witnesses were next. Most were simply threatened into silence. Imperial agents visited them in the night, making clear what would happen if they ever spoke of what they had seen. Many families fled the capital entirely, seeking anonymity in distant provinces. But some witnesses wouldn't stay silent. These were handled more permanently. Within a month, dozens of people who had watched Marcus die had themselves disappeared. No trials, no accusations, no explanations. They simply vanished, as if they had never existed. Just like the Empire wanted Marcus to vanish. The executioners were among the first to disappear. These men who had operated the scorpion's sting, who knew exactly how it worked and what it had done, were considered too dangerous to leave alive. They knew too much. They had seen too much. Their bodies were never found. But here's the thing about cover-ups. They almost never work completely. Because you can burn documents, but you can't burn memories. You can silence witnesses, but you can't silence whispers. You can destroy evidence, but you can't destroy the truth that lives in the hearts of people who saw something they can never forget. The Empire tried to erase Marcus for over a century. They failed. Stories passed from parent to child in hushed voices. Merchants who traveled between cities carried tales of what they had heard. Servants who worked in noble houses remembered fragments of conversations they weren't supposed to hear. The legend of Marcus and the scorpion's sting grew with each passing generation. Details changed. Some were exaggerated. Others were lost. But the core truth remained. The Empire had committed an atrocity. and no amount of censorship could make the people forget. Modern historians have spent decades piecing together what really happened. Working from fragmentary sources, coded references in other documents, and oral traditions that survived in remote communities, they've reconstructed a picture of the execution and its aftermath. What they've found confirms the worst of the legends. The execution of Marcus wasn't just brutal. It was calculated. Every aspect was designed not for justice but for terror. The empire's leadership genuinely believed that enough fear could maintain their control indefinitely. They were wrong. Historians now identify the execution as a turning point. Not because it crushed rebellion, but because it created it. Before Marcus, dissent was scattered and disorganized. After Marcus, it had a symbol, a martyr, a reason to unite. The reforms that followed the riots were too little, too late. The empire was forced to moderate its most brutal practices, but the damage was done. Trust between the government and its citizens never recovered. Every subsequent policy was viewed through the lens of what they had done to Marcus. Could they do it again? Would they do it again? These questions poisoned every interaction between rulers and ruled for generations. The empire eventually fell, as all empires do. But historians argue that its decline began not with military defeats or economic collapse, but with a single execution that revealed its true nature. When a government rules through terror, every act of brutality becomes a recruitment tool for its enemies. The empire learned this lesson too late. But perhaps the most haunting part of this entire story is what we still don't know. We don't know what Marcus actually discovered. Those financial records he was investigating, the corruption he uncovered, the secrets that cost him his life. All of it was destroyed along with the evidence of his execution. The cover-up was so thorough that we can't even identify who was responsible for his downfall. Some theories suggest it was a faction within the imperial court, using Marcus as a way to eliminate a political rival. Others believe the emperor himself was involved in the corruption, and Marcus had stumbled onto evidence that could have toppled the throne. A few scholars argue that the conspiracy went even deeper, that Marcus had discovered something about the empire's origins, its founding myths, its claim to legitimate rule. Something so dangerous that killing him wasn't enough. They had to destroy his memory entirely. We'll probably never know the truth. The empire's censorship was too effective. The witnesses are long dead. The documents are ash. Whatever secret Marcus uncovered died with him on that platform, his screams carrying the truth into oblivion. All that remains is the legend. A man who asked the wrong questions. A government that responded with unimaginable cruelty. And an empire that destroyed itself trying to hide what it had done. There's a lesson in this story that extends far beyond ancient history. Every society faces a choice in how it deals with those who challenge authority. Some choose dialogue. Some choose reform. Some choose repression. The empire chose terror. And in doing so, they sealed their own fate. Because terror has a half-life. It works in the short term. People cower. Dissent goes underground. The appearance of order is maintained. But beneath the surface, resentment builds. Anger grows. The memory of atrocity becomes a rallying cry that no amount of force can silence. Marcus wanted to be remembered as a reformer. A man who tried to root out corruption and make the empire stronger. Instead, he's remembered as a victim. A symbol. a warning about what happens when power becomes its own justification. The scorpion's sting was meant to make people fear the empire. Instead, it made them hate it, and that hatred outlasted everything the empire tried to build. Today, the ruins of that civilization attract tourists and archaeologists. They walk through the remains of temples and markets and government buildings, trying to imagine what life was like in this once great society. But there's one place most visitors avoid. The central square where Marcus was executed has never been successfully excavated. Multiple attempts have been made over the centuries, but each one has been abandoned. Equipment fails. Workers refuse to continue. Strange accidents occur. Superstition most likely. The weight of history playing tricks on modern minds. But some locals tell different stories. They say the square is haunted. Not by Marcus himself, but by the memory of what happened there. They claim that on certain nights, when the wind is right and the moon is full, you can still hear screaming echoing off the ancient stones. The screams of a man who asked the wrong questions. The screams that an empire tried to silence. The screams that echo through history as a reminder of what power can do when it fears the truth more than it values justice. Marcus has been dead for centuries. The empire has been dust for nearly as long. The scorpion's sting exists only in fragmentary descriptions and nightmarish legends. But the lesson remains. Power that maintains itself through terror is power built on sand. It might stand for a generation. It might stand for a century. But eventually, the tide of human dignity rises and washes it away. Marcus probably didn't know he would become a symbol. He probably didn't imagine that his death would spark the beginning of an empire's end. He was just a man who saw something wrong and tried to fix it. That's all any of us can do. See what's wrong, speak the truth, and hope that even if we fail, even if the worst happens, our stand means something to those who come after. The empire tried to erase Marcus from history. Instead, they made him immortal, and the execution they wanted forgotten became the one thing history refused to let go. If this story made you think differently about power, fear, and the hidden lessons buried in forgotten history, there are more stories like this. More secrets that empires tried to bury. More truths that survived despite every attempt to destroy them. The past is full of voices that were silenced, names that were erased, events that those in power desperately wanted us to forget. But the whispers always survive. And as long as there are people willing to listen, willing to dig through the ashes and piece together the fragments, those voices will never truly fall silent. Marcus is still speaking. The question is whether we're willing to hear what he has to say.